Rick Bradford has spoken to us today about the bias in the incarceration rates of men in prison in the UK. He's previously spoken to us about the failure of boys in school and the bias against boys in the examination system. He's also talked about the coercive control of men, about the loneliness of men who've been through the family court, and discussed with us the ways in which the leading charities for women could perhaps function more effectively if they had a more balanced support for men as well as for women. But today the discussion is about the bias in the judicial system with regard to the incarceration of men and the conviction rates of men. And it's a tremendous tour de force of data as usual.
So Rick, thank you very much for coming back to talk to us again. It's always good to hear from you. And on this occasion, we're going to hear from you about sex bias in imprisonment.
So this is what I would plan to present if we can get through it. So I'll start off fairly gently with just the big picture of the statistics on prisoners and crime. And then I'll go on to presenting the main case for sex bias on imprisonment. And for this part, I'll be assuming conviction. So, I mean, there's many places in which you can get bias, and you can get bias before conviction as well as after. But for this bit, I would just be talking about, if you assume conviction, what bias is there in the subsequent sentencing, and particularly whether you're sentenced to prison or not. So that'll be, I suppose, the main event, but it's also quite important to go on to the next bit, which is addressing common criticisms, because I'll come to a very hard-hitting conclusion in section 2, which, you know, people find hard to swallow because it is so hard-hitting. And then they will raise quite reasonably a range of fairly obvious objections saying this is where your analysis might fall down. And pretty much all of those have got, you know, a good response. So I need to go through that to complete the picture.
Yeah.
Then I'll go back to what happens before conviction and look at what we can say about sex bias before it gets to the stage of conviction. So in other words, on arrest and on prosecution and on cautions and things like that. Then very importantly, given that my conclusion is going to be there is a bias and a big one, where does it come from? Well, part of it is innate. Human perception of gender is skewed. It's not, you know, we have a gendered perception, but that's exacerbated by policy. So I just want to expose issues of policy that drive the different ways that the sexes are treated in criminal justice. And then finally, woozles, one of my favorite words. Are you familiar with woozles?
No.
A woozle is something that everyone believes, but which is either not true or grossly exaggerated, and it's gained credibility in the public mind by repetition. But when you look for the evidence, it isn't there. So it's basically, what do they call it? Fake news, I suppose, is the other name for it.
Do we need to reference Pooh Bear for this?
Absolutely, yeah. I think he's got a copyright. On my blog, there's a picture of Pooh and Piglet going around a tree, following their own tracks. That's when they discovered the woozle, which of course was themselves. So their woozle hypothesis was not well founded because they'd made up the evidence. Right. Okay, let's get going on the big picture stats. So hopefully you can see prison population graph there.
Yeah.
Is that clear? This is from, all this, by the way, is national statistics. So this particular graph is from House of Commons Library. I'll be using a lot of data from Ministry of Justice and Office for National Statistics, the usual stuff. So it's all sound data in that respect. So what you see here is the total prison population. Well, no, this isn't prison population. This is the increase of prison population in percent since the year 1900. So going back to the beginning of the 20th century. So 0 there means no increase since 1900. And you'll see that it didn't vary too much over the period to the end of the Second World War. But after the Second World War, the total prison population has been climbing. And it's now plus 400%, which is 5 times the prison population. Now, one immediate rejoinder to that is, well, that's all very well, but the total population has been increasing. So is that really an increase in the rate at which we imprison people? Or is that increase just a reflection of the increasing population? Well, the answer is yes, the population has increased, but not by anything like that amount. So if you look at it in terms of rate and look at the prison population per 100,000 of the population over the same period, you still see this same quite precipitate increase since the Second World War. So it's real. There's been a huge increase. So question, why is that? The obvious answer would be, well, there's more crime or something. Well, we'll have a look at that in a minute, but first we'll look at how that breaks down by sex. So this next graph is showing the same data, not over the, well, yes, it is over the same time base from 1900, but it disaggregates women prisoners and men prisoners. So women are the red line, men are the blue line, black is the total. So this immediately tells you an important story about who are the most of the prisoners. The women prisoners are about 5%, rather less than 5% now, actually, of the total. So prisoners are almost all men, is what that amounts to. And we'll come back to this. But the data I'm going to be showing is mostly from my book. I've been a bit lazy, so the data is a couple of years old now. And when I wrote the book, I said that there were 21 times more men than women in prison. Well, that's now 24 times. So it's increased that much in 2 years. So however you look at it, we are incarcerating a lot more people than we used to. And note that it went up most steeply in the 90s. That's the steepest bit there. It's rather flattened off now, by the way, over the last few years. Whether that's going to persist, I don't know. So has crime been going up? Is that the reason why we're imprisoning more people? Well, this is total crime. This is not on the same time base because I don't have the records going back that far. This is from 1981 and it's based on the crime survey for England and Wales. So it's survey data, but the CSEW is generally taken to be the best indicator of total crime, as opposed from...
Can we just ask, Rick, is that a survey of the public or a survey of the police, or who is being surveyed in the survey data?
It's a survey of the public.
Have they suffered a crime? Have they experienced a crime?
No, this is the annual survey, which is sponsored by the Office for National Statistics, but carried out by professional survey organisations on their behalf. It's done annually and it covers a whole range of issues. So part of it is the intimate partner violence survey, for example, which is where all the domestic violence figures come from. In terms, prevalence of DV comes from that same survey, a subset of the survey. But this is the general crime one. And they pick people at random, roughly the same number of men and women. And I can't remember how many they have in the sample now, but it's at least 20,000. And I think sometimes more than that, 30 or 40,000. So it's a pretty big survey. It's a lot bigger than political polls, which tend to be 1,000 people. And they have to sample a lot because some of these crimes are quite rare. So yes, it's a random section of the population, and how they do that, of course, is subject to a lot of agonizing by the professionals involved in terms of getting a representative survey. So they're not just going to, you know, one demographic and getting, you know, people from the upper end or the lower end of society to, they're somehow, you know, trying to get across genuine representative cross section of the public. So for that reason, and because it's been done on broadly the same methodologies since 1981, so 40 years now, it's generally taken to be the best indicator both of total volume of crime and certainly the best indicator of trends of crime, as opposed from police data, which has been much more variable. So this is total crime. And you can see that it peaked in 1995. And it's been falling quite precipitately ever since. So the total crime has been falling precipitately whilst people were incarcerating is going up. Now, this is just an interesting observation in itself because the two things do seem rather starkly at odds. And it's not, as far as I can see, people don't talk about this very much. When they talk about crime, they'll sometimes politicians will big up crime so they can present themselves as being tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, sort of thing. But they don't often say, well, actually, total crime has been going down. You know, why don't we celebrate that?
But it could be that they're all in prison. The criminals are all in prison, and therefore no crime. Isn't that the argument in the first place?
Well, I suppose you could argue that, but I don't think it holds water if you look at it. Another answer is that a lot of this crime is summary offences, and they're not the sort of offences for which you'd be sent to prison. The bulk of those offences are not ones for which you'll be sent to prison. So if you want to see something that might be more indicative of, you know, why we're putting more people in prison, you would want to look at serious crimes. So if we look at violence against the person category of crimes, which is, you know, clearly a more serious than, you know, parking offences or something, then it looks like this. So the continuous lines there are the survey data, and the dashed lines at the bottom are the police recorded data. And you'll see that if you go back more than a few years, there's a big difference between the two. And this was recognised for a long time. And it's because, and I think the ONS and the police are quite open about this, the police were not recording everything. So the police reports were underreported, basically. That's why people tend to take the CSEW as being the better indicator. This is all violence against the person. The blue line is with injury, the brown line without injury, the black line, some of the two. And similar colour coding for police reports. One interesting thing, though, is if you look at the most recent data I've got here, which is 2018, the police reports look to be converging on the survey results, which is quite encouraging. That it gives a bit of an extra credibility both to the survey and the police, I suppose. So the big picture then on crimes of violence is that's been falling precipitately as well. So it does rather leave in your head this question: why are we incarcerating more people? Well, I'm just going to leave that question on the table because I don't really know the answer. But they're the big picture stats, and just to complete that, this is what the actual numbers look like in terms of convictions. So this isn't crimes which would be reported in the survey, because many of those would not be prosecuted or convicted. But these are actual conviction statistics. And I separate clearly between the indictable offences and the summary offences. So typically, there may be exceptions to this, but typically summary offences would be treated at magistrates' courts and indictable offences at Crown courts. So potentially, I think generally for indictable offences, you'd be facing a jury trial, whereas summary offences, it's just a magistrate. That's broadly the difference. And magistrates can't send people to prison for more than a certain length of time. And in practice, they rarely go up to the limit of their powers. So you're not going to very often get sent to prison for a summary offence. And if you are, it's only for a short time. So prison really aligns more with the indictable offences as a general rule. So the interesting thing here is the ratio, because I'll be talking about sex bias. So what's the ratio of convictions of men to women? Well, men are certainly convicted more than women. Whether that actually means that this is a valid reflection of the extent to which men are more criminal than women is a more difficult issue, and we'll come back to that. But I mean, I'm inclined to think men are more criminal than women, but the amount by which they are may not be quite faithfully reflected in these figures. But for the time being, let's just take this at face value. So for total crimes, men commit just a bit less than 3 times more crimes than women, or rather I should say they're convicted of just less than 3 times more. But if you look at the indictable offences, the more serious offences, that's more like a factor of 6. Okay. So on that basis, given what I've said, you might expect there to be about 6 times more men in prison, because the indictable offences are what get you sent to prison, and men are being convicted for 6 times more. So you might expect there, crudely speaking, to be 6 times more men in prison, but there's actually 24 times more men in prison. And it's that difference that exercises me. So now we drill in to the details. So I'm now going to assume conviction. So whether you're a man or a woman, I'm going to assume you're a person that's been convicted. So if I just shrink that a bit, you can see the words. There we are. So assuming conviction, that any disparity on imprisonment has 3 sources. There's a potential difference of treatment in terms of whether you are sentenced to immediate imprisonment or given some other sentence like suspended sentence or community sentence. But there's also potentially a difference of the average sentence length you're given if you are sentenced to prison. And thirdly, there's the issue of parole, because most people only serve somewhere around about half their nominal sentence, but the exact proportion differs from case to case. So is there a difference of treatment in terms of when people are paroled by sex? Well, there is a disparity by sex on all 3 of those things. So let's go through each one in turn. If you look first at the gender disparity on whether you're sentenced to immediate custody. So that's this graph. Just make it slightly bigger. So I'm showing data here from 2006 to 2016, and I'm showing it for the different offence categories that the MOJ regularly report this data in. And there's about 10 of them. So there's violence against the person, robbery, criminal damage, possession of weapons, crimes against society, sexual offences, etc. So each one of those is a different colour-coded line. And what's being plotted here is the disparity on whether you're sentenced to prison, assuming you're convicted. So this is the ratio of the proportion of men who are convicted who are sent to prison, divided by the proportion of women who are convicted who are sent to prison. Okay, so if that's 2, that means twice the proportion of men who are convicted are sent to prison. And all this, by the way, I'll be talking about proportions, not volume of crime. If we're talking about volumes of crime, then men, as we've seen, commit 3 times more crimes, 6 times more indictable offences. So the volumes of crimes by men would be a lot bigger than for women. So let's get that straight. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about if you have been convicted, then what's your chance of being sent to prison, and how does that vary according to whether you're a man and a woman? Okay. And the answer is, according to this data, as you can see, other than the odd point, which is just a gnat's whisker below 1, which would be equal treatment, all the data virtually is above 1 and substantially above 1, going up to a highest level of about 3. And the mean of that data, if you put a line through the middle of it, it's about 1.8. Okay, now that's my graph based on MOJ data.
So let's just turn that into, just to repeat that. So 1.8, if that's the average, that means that men are 1.8 times as likely to be imprisoned for the same offence.
Yes.
For the same kind of offence, anyway.
For the same kind of the same category of offence.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah,
that's right. That's why it's important to break that down by category.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some obvious rejoinders to that, which I'll come to in the next section when I go through the obvious comments. But yes, so you've correctly understood it, and that is backed up by a 2016 Ministry of Justice report, in which they did essentially the same thing that I've done in that graph, but they've done it a lot better, because instead of just drawing a graph and looking at what the data looks like on the graph, they've used multivariate logistic regression, which means that they can control for a whole range of variables, such as not only sex and offence category, which is what I'm looking at there, but they also controlled on ethnicity, on age, and importantly on previous criminal history. Okay, and their conclusion is, despite controlling for all that, under similar criminal circumstances, in other words, all those other things being equal, the odds of imprisonment for males was 1.88 times that for women. So essentially the same conclusion as myself. So there's no question that that is what the data says.
Sorry, does that mean that the gender difference, the sex difference, is more important, or swamps the impact of ethnic differences or pre-conviction background, etc.? Is that what it means?
Well, if you looked at their regression, they would have a B coefficient that would tell you what the ethnicity effect was. I don't think they reported it in that report, or if they did, I can't recall what it was. But I'm not making any claim on race here. I've not looked at that, not looked at the race issue personally. And what this says is not quite that. It says that if you control for race, there's still that effect on gender. So even if there was a race issue, let's say for sake of argument, blacks were twice as likely to be imprisoned. What that would mean is a black man would be 8.88 times more likely to be imprisoned than a black woman. And a white man is 1.88 times more likely to be imprisoned than a white woman.
Okay.
So that 1.88 is purely the gender effect controlled for the race issue. I can tell you that there will be race issues for sure. And I do know that evidence from the States, there's a paper by Sonia Starr from Michigan, who disaggregates race and sex and finds that they're both significant. But I think her conclusion was the sex issue was larger than the race issue. They were both large, but the sex issue is larger. Whether that's true in the UK, I'm not so sure, but it might be.
But we're not minimizing either. It's just focused on the sex difference.
No, I'm certainly not minimizing the race issue, no. But this 1.88 is controlled for the race issue. So that's the purely sex issue. There would be, so in other words, if you're a black man, you've got a double whammy, to put it simply.
Yeah.
So that's the disparity on whether you are sent down, you're sent to prison. But then that's nothing to do with sentence length. And the prison population is also going to depend on sentence length. I mean, if you put people in prison for twice as long, prison population will be twice as big at any instant. So what's the disparity on sentence length? And you can define this in a similar sort of way. Now we're assuming that a man is sentenced to prison. He's not only convicted, he's sentenced to prison And similarly, a woman is not only convicted, but sentenced to prison. In each case, what sentence length are they given? Nominal award, not taking parole into account. And what's the average of that over men and the average over women? So the disparity on sentence length is the average sentence length that a convicted man who is sentenced to prison would get for a given offence category divided by that for women. So again, one would be equality, equal treatment. And the data here is for same crime categories as before, a dozen or so crime categories. The big bold black line is just the line of equality, so you can see where it is. There's one crime category, which I think is criminal damage, which is below, which indicates women get slightly longer sentences. Don't know why that is, but for all the other ones, they're substantially above one. So again, if you put a line through that, the average is somewhere around about 1.7 or something like that. Well, no, the average is a bit lower there. It's about 1.5, but that's relatively old data, 1999 to 2009. Exactly the same quantity, but plotted for more recent data, 2006 to 2016. If anything, the line, again, criminal damage is the one that's below one. The others are all above one. And in particular, theft and public order offences are quite high. And the average of that is about 1.7. Just in passing, you might have noticed that on this graph, there's a black arrow there. The reason I've highlighted that is this is an illustration of how politicians behave, which won't be a surprise to you, I'm sure, but it shocked me anyway. I'm naive. In 2016, Philip Davis MP gave a talk to a men's conference in which he talked about imprisonment issues. And he told us his story about how he was always told that women were treated more harshly in the criminal justice system. So he got the House of Commons Library to dig out some data, and lo and behold, they dug out this data, of course, because this is the data. And they gave him the data, and he was shocked to find that actually men are treated more harshly than women. So he was giving a talk on this and giving some of the stats, and some of the stats he gave was from this particular data set. And of course, after this conference, he was lambasted in the press, and the usual culprits were saying he got it all wrong. It was all nonsense. One of those saying that was Baroness Jean Corsten, author of the famous 2007 Corsten report. And she wrote an article in The Guardian in which she tried to discredit the data he'd quoted, essentially data from this data set, by quoting just one number. And the one number she quoted was that one. Right? Now, if you look at that, that is just slightly below one. It's actually at 0.99. And she quoted that number as if it was discrediting what he'd said, and by implication, discrediting the claim. So the dishonesty of this is quite remarkable, that anyone, because I mean, she will have taken that data, not from a graph, which I plotted, but from tabulated data from which I plotted this graph. But it's impossible, it's perceptually impossible to look at that table of figures and pick out the 0.99 figure and not be aware that all the other figures in the table are virtually above one. It's impossible. She can't possibly have missed that. So she knew what she was doing. And it's just, I call it constructive mendacity, because I'm sure there's nothing she wrote that is actually factually untrue, but the overall implication of it was to grossly mislead and to deliberately grossly mislead in what she'd said. So it made me so angry that I've highlighted that issue. And finally, in the trio of potential areas for disparity, there's parole. So this is the fraction of your awarded sentence you actually serve. And there's lots of data from the MOJ on this. And you can average over what fraction men serve and what fraction women serve. In both cases, it's round about half. But for women, it tends to be a little bit less than half, and for men, a little bit more than half. So on average, there's a disparity of about 20%, a factor of 1.2 in women's favour. So summarising all that, the conclusion is, my conclusion, this is my simple take on it, is you've got a disparity on being sentenced to prison of 1.88. You've got a disparity on the sentence length on top of that of 1.75. And then you've got a disparity on parole of 1.2. They're all factors, so they multiply up. And if you multiply those three numbers together, lo and behold, you get 4. And that factor of 4, I claim, is the explanation for why there's 24 times more men in prison, in contrast with men committing 6 times more indictable offences. That's where that comes from. In other words, and this is the
That's pretty neat, Rick. 6 4 is 24. So you couldn't have asked for better figures, could you?
No. Well, when I first did this, there was 21 times more men in prison, so it didn't work out quite so well. But these, I don't claim any great accuracy here. I mean, and there are exceptional issues which we'll go through. So I'm not claiming this is exact science, and that coincidence is a bit of a coincidence. Let's look at the common criticisms, because there's answers to most of them, if not all of them. So so people think it can't be true, and this is why it may not be true. So the first rejoinder is, yeah, but women offend most in the less serious categories of offence. So women commit a smaller proportion of the violent offences and a larger proportion of the, offences you would deem not so serious, and so they get shorter sentences or are less likely to be imprisoned. Well, it's not actually true, and I'll show you the data. Secondly, then, if you have to admit that the distribution, the pattern of offending across those broad categories is much the same between the sexes, which it is, then perhaps there's a difference within each category. So, yeah, a woman might be convicted for a violence against a person offence, but is the average violence against a person offence by a woman less serious than that by a man? So women are getting convicted for relatively minor, slaps and pushes or something, whereas, men are getting convicted for crippling someone for life. Well, no, the evidence seems to be against that too. The pattern seems to be much the same where they are convicted. The next one, favourite one, is men's harsher sentencing is because of their longer history of offending. So these men, they've committed 30 or 40 other offences before. They're serious recidivists, whereas women are getting imprisoned for a first offence. Now, that's not true either. The recidivism is broadly similar. Then there are sex offences. Isn't that a special case? Oh, yes. Sex offences are definitely a special case, and we'll have a look at that. And similarly, homicide offences are a special case, because 92% of homicides are committed by men. So that's a special case as well. So they need particular attention. And then finally, what about childcare issues? Because women are more likely to be responsible for childcare, and childcare is a valid mitigation against imprisonment. And it is. It's valid in the Equal Treatment Bench Book. It's a mitigation that you can use to mitigate against imprisonment. So that one's true, certainly true in principle. The question is the numerical significance of that one. So we'll have a look at the data there. So let's look at each of those issues. So first of all, pattern of offending. Now, I emphasize what I'm looking at here is the pattern of offending. So I'm looking at the proportion of people of the same sex that are convicted or arrested for a given offence category. Not absolute numbers. If it was absolute numbers, the men figures would be a lot bigger than the women. It's huge, far bigger. We've seen that. But this isn't about volume. This is about pattern of offending. Okay. So if you look first at arrest data, what are people arrested for? Well, few people will be surprised to hear that the commonest reason for a man to be arrested is for violence against the person. But perhaps people would be surprised to hear that the commonest reason for a woman to be arrested is also violence against a person. And the top bar in this histogram, blue is for males and orange is for females. It's broadly similar for the two, somewhere around about 35% for both sexes. The second most likely for both sexes is theft offences. The third most likely, narrowly, is miscellaneous crimes against society. And after that, you get three categories which are broadly similar: public order offences, drug offences, and criminal damage and arson. And you'll see the characteristic of those is that there's not that much difference between the sexes. The only one, and most of the other ones, the volume of offending is small. The only one where there's a significant sex difference is in sexual offences, which we'll come to, because that certainly is a distinction. Apart from that, the pattern of offending is remarkably similar. You see the same thing if you look not at arrest, but at proportion of legal aid workload, which is, I suppose, roughly speaking, a reflection of whether you're being prosecuted or not. And again, the pattern between the sexes is broadly similar. Offences against the person, stroke homicide, and theft are the two biggest ones for both sexes. And the pattern is broadly similar across all of them. Sexual offences, no, very small there. And then if you look at the proportion of sentenced prisoners by offence group, so these are actual prisoners, so they're convicted and sent to prison, and look at what they're in prison for, violence against the person is again the most common for both sexes. For both sexes. Big difference for sexual offences where it's mostly men, but other than that, it's not too different between the sexes. So the pattern of offending is broadly similar. So that's evidence number one. But that's according to the broad categories. So there's still this other issue of, well, yeah, women may commit the same, may be convicted for the same proportion of violent offences, but are their violent offences less serious than men's? So here's violence against the person offences broken down into 6 subcategories: affray, common assault, GBH, ABH, and GBH with intent, and other violent offences of varying severities. I guess affray and common assault are the two least serious, and GBH with intent, I suppose, is the most serious. Blue is males again, red is females, remarkably similar. Again, so it's not true that women's violent offense. If you are a violent woman and you're convicted, you're likely to be just as violent as a man, is what that says. Smaller volume of violent women, yes, but if you're one of them, you're just as bad, is what that says. And you can see this in the 2016 Ministry of Justice report I referred to. You can see that reflected in their conclusions. The most common offence, these are all their conclusions from that report now. The most common offence for both sexes was violence against a person, accounting for 22% of women convicted and the same percentage of men convicted. However, whilst 20% of men convicted for that were imprisoned, only 7% of women convicted for that were imprisoned. Women are far more likely to be cautioned as well. We'll come to that. And there's a lot of, it's worth reading that report because it's so hard-hitting, the conclusions. For example, if you look at the other offences, where it's harder to see even in principle why there would be a difference between men and women. The second most common offence for both men and women being convicted, that is, was drink driving, accounting for 15% of women's convictions and 12% of men's. However, while 700 men were imprisoned for drink driving, seemingly no women were. Well, I have to say that 0% may be rounded. So that may mean less than 0.5%, which would mean a few women, but not very many. So that's an incredibly stark difference. And yet think about it. Drink driving, it's about the danger to the public, about injuring or possibly killing people through dangerous driving. What difference does it make if it's a man behind the wheel or a woman behind the wheel? It doesn't make any difference. And yet this is treated completely differently.
And as we were talking to Deborah Powney in our most recent interview with her, she was explaining that the issue about whether women can inflict as much injury on a man as a man on a woman is made up for by women weaponizing and using using weapons to increase the impact of their violence.
Yeah. I remember reading a report in a newspaper once, which I thought must be a one-off, but it turned out not to be. And it was a woman, a young woman, who had an altercation with a man in the evening over a taxi. You know, they must have been squabbling over whose taxi it was. Now, this was a woman not on her own. She was with two male companions, so she was not unprotected. But she lost her rag with this man, and she took off her stiletto-heeled shoe and thrust the stiletto heel into this man's eye. And there was a picture of him with blood pouring down his face. I thought, my God, fancy even thinking of doing that. Fancy even thinking of using a shoe as a weapon. But subsequent to that, I've seen several other cases in which women have used stiletto heels as weapons. So it must be a well-known thing. But yeah, exactly. Women are not as violent in general. A smaller percentage of women are violent, but my goodness, when they are, they know how to do it. And you can go through these cases. It's more and more of the same stuff. It's hard to understand in some of these categories why there should be a difference of treatment. So the final category here is men's harsh sentencing due to their offending history? Is this the reason? It's because men are serious recidivists. Well, I think if you talk to barristers, they'll tell you you've got to try hard to get sent to prison. You've probably got to have offended many times before. And that's probably true of both sexes. But there appears not to be much difference between the two sexes in that respect. So here's two quotes from the Ministry of Justice report, Statistics on Women and the Criminal Justice System, 2015. Males were more likely to be sentenced to immediate custody and to receive custodial sentences of six months or longer than females with a similar criminal history. And although males were more likely to reoffend, females had a higher number of proven reoffences on average per reoffender. Okay, so I think it's quite hard to get your head around what that's saying, but what I think it's saying is a larger percentage of men will have one or more previous offences, but where women do have a previous offences, they will tend to have more than men. So again, it's another myth that is part of the narrative that tries to explain why women are treated more gently, but actually I interpret all this as rationalizations of a more lenient treatment that isn't based on fact. It's just a determination to rationalize the existing narrative. So let's look at the two exceptional cases now, homicide and sex offences. Homicide is an exception. 92% of homicides are committed by men. I don't have exact numbers for the number of people in prison currently for homicide, but I estimate it's something around 7,000 men and perhaps about 600 women, something like that. So this is disproportionate. This would weaken my argument because it does show that men are more than 6 times more criminal in respect of homicide. But it doesn't undermine the argument that much because homicide only accounts for 9 or 10% of the total prison population. So my argument still goes through for the other 90% of the prison population, I would say. So it's a weakening, it's a valid criticism, but not a serious objection to the broad thrust of the argument. Then there's sex offences, and my goodness, this is a real different one. When I last looked, there were 13,600 men in prison for sex offences, which is about double the number in for homicide, and 100 women. Well, people won't be surprised by that, but perhaps they should be. This, to my mind, it doesn't undermine my case that women are treated more leniently and men more harshly. It's actually the most extreme example of that. It's the most extreme example. But that 100 women in prison does not reflect even the extent of adult women's sexual victimization of male children, from what we can see from the statistics, because it just doesn't marry up with the number of men in prison for sex offences. And then there's women offending against female minors, which from what I can see is roughly as common as against male minors. And then what Siobhan Weir has identified is there's the issue, and this is what the public are most resistant to accepting, the possibility of sexual offending by women against adult men. And that is completely hidden in our culture, completely hidden. And yet sex offences are defined by consent. They're not defined any longer by force. So in as far as there ever was any rationalisation to this gender skew in sex offences, because it was based on force and therefore presumption was the man was always physically stronger. So, but that's long since gone out of the window because it's about consent. Where we are now actually is men's consent doesn't matter. That's really where we are. And if you actually ask people in surveys about consent, which we don't do in the UK, I think the likes of the CSEW and other surveys tend not to ask questions about whether men were consenting to sex. But the Americans do, and they get data which is quite startling, because you find that men are forced or coerced into sexual activity against their will by female partners not that much less frequently than the reverse. But it's the way it's perceived. And it's the way it's perceived which is different. It's just not perceived as being particularly wrong because it's not perceived as being particularly damaging. Well, simply put, this is certainly not an area that undermines the claim that women are treated more leniently than men, because sex offences are the most extreme example of that. Forget about all the numbers. It doesn't undermine that qualitative claim. And finally, the one final objection, and this is the one which does have some validity, actually. And this is the issue of childcare. Women are far more likely to have childcare responsibilities than men. Of course, it may be joint, but it'll tend to be the woman that has that, again, claimed as a mitigation. And it's a valid mitigation in law, in the judicial guidance. The real question, and I'm shocked at how difficult I found it to get solid data on this, but the real question is what proportion of women who are convicted or women who are sentenced to prison do have childcare responsibilities. And the best source, I think, is another MOJ report from 2015, based on a survey of those convicted and offended, which came to this conclusion. Between 24% and 31%, so they had different ways of estimating it, so it's the lower bound and an upper bound, but somewhere between 24 and 31% of all female offenders were estimated to have one or more child dependents. So that's offenders, okay? But amongst the different disposal types, women receiving immediate custody were significantly less likely to have child dependents, between 13% and 19%. And that, I presume, is the operation of the mitigation in reducing the 24 to 31 down to almost half that level, because the judges have used that mitigation to deflect women away from prison. So in terms of actual prisoners, it would appear 13 to 19% from that report, which is the report I've always quoted in the past. It seems to be the most reliable, most recent report that I could find. But if anyone else has better data, I'd like to see it. However, if you do a bit of Googling, you will probably come up with a figure I've quoted down below, 66% by Rona Epstein in that report, Mothers in Prison, Sentencing of Mothers and the Rights of the Child. But when I looked at that, she simply quotes that figure of 66% with no citation, no source, no provenance at all. So I can't regard that as having any particular credibility. However, there's an older reference which comes up with a figure of 61%. This goes back to a very old survey in 1994 by Cadell and Crisp, issued by the Home Office. Unfortunately, I just could not get that Home Office research study online. Try as I might, it doesn't seem to be online anymore. So I couldn't examine what the basis of that was, but from secondary reports, it appeared to be a large-scale, extensive survey. So that gives me pause, because possibly in 1994, the figure was 61%, which is very high. But it's not impossible that in 27 years, the percentage has fallen from 61% to below 20%. It's not impossible because we know that women are having children now substantially later than they used to. And we know that the prison population is skewed strongly to early 20s, essentially. So it may well be that both figures are right, but it's changed in time. But this is the area in which I feel most uncertain, because I'm not 100% sure I know what the situation is here. But childcare is a valid mitigation. So if it was indeed 61% of women that are, well, if it was 61% in prison, then doesn't say much for the effectiveness of the mitigation, I suppose. If it's less than 20%, then that's probably genuinely being applied. But it's still only a certain proportion, probably high 20s% of offenders. So it's still 2/3 or so, or 3/4 of women offenders for which that would not apply. So that would weaken my argument for sure, but not annihilate it completely. So all that I've been talking about is really based on the assumption of conviction. But there's other issue. What happens before conviction? And one imponderable is who's more likely to be convicted if they're behaving in the, not convicted, arrested, if they're behaving in the same way? Well, I don't know. The trouble with that is if you're not arrested, you never feature in the statistics. So it's an imponderable. So I don't know what the bias might be on arrest. But certainly there's a lot of data on things like cautions. So if you are arrested, how likely are you to be prosecuted? Well, you won't be prosecuted if they, quote, let you off with a caution. It's not really a let off because you'll have a record, but you don't have to be prosecuted. So you don't face that threat. Well, this is the disparity on being offered a caution.
Which slide are we looking at, Rick?
This is the top one. So this is figure 8.8.
Just bring it down a little bit. That's the way, yeah.
So again, it's the same format as before. A value of 1 here would mean equally likely if you're a man or a woman to be offered a caution for the same category of offence. And, factor of 2 means twice as likely to be offered a caution if you're a woman for the same category of offence. And you'll see the data is mostly above 1. And for violence against the person, please note, it's this line here, which goes up to 4. So as a woman, you're 4 times more likely to be offered a caution for a violence against the person offence. So they're being deflected away from prosecution, let alone imprisonment, is what that means. And similarly on better news, really, I think, is the disparity on conviction. So assuming you are prosecuted, how likely are you to be convicted? So again, in the same format, this is the disparity. It is either round about 1, which is equality, so that's good, or a bit bigger than 1. So again, men are somewhat more likely to be convicted if they're prosecuted. But the figures are nowhere near as large as for the others. So I would conclude from that juries are relatively unbiased, slightly biased against men again, but not numerically, not as bad as the other graphs we've seen. So that's better news than the other things, I would say. And then the woozles. Oh no, the sex bias by policy is even more important. Just very quickly, because we've talked about culture and gender perceptions and so on is certainly part of the issue, but it's exacerbated now by policy, and this may be why the ratio has been going up, George. We have things like the Corsten report, which is, I mean, some people will read the Corsten report and say, well, this is just saying nice, sensible things about treating women nicely, which it is, and if you want to think of it that way. But here's my all-time favorite quote. Equality does not mean treating everyone the same. That's fine, as long as you're not one of the ones that are being treated less equally, because that's what it means. It means some animals are more equal than others, but it's enshrined there in writing clearly. And the whole report is full of that. That's the sentiment that drives it. And here's one example from many you could pull out of the Corsten report. Prison is disproportionately, she means disproportionately, prison is disproportionately harsher for women because prisons and practices within them have, for the most part, been designed for men. So it's harsher for women because it's the same as it is for men. You just need to pause and digest that. That's not logic, that's sentiment. It's saying you can't treat women the same way as you treat men, because that would be horrible. And that's what people feel. And that's why people like the Corsten report. But it certainly isn't equality, and it's not logic. You can't say it's harsher because it's the same, which is what she's saying. It's a sort of verbal legerdemain that making it look like women are treating harsher. No, she's actually complaining about women being treated the same, because you can't treat women the same as you treat men, because that will be horrible.
And going back to our conversation with Naomi Murphy at HMP Whitemoor, she was pointing out to us that women's prisons in fact offer a far higher degree of psychological input and psychological support to their inmates than male prisons, or male prisoners get much less psychological support or offers of treatment.
In terms of sex bias by policy, the Corsten report's caused me very influential, and it's driven thinking ever since it was published. And it's now, that sentiment is reflected in the Equal Treatment Bench Book. This is something people have to acknowledge. The guidance being given to judges on what equality means is this sentiment. And here's a quote from it. True equal treatment may not always mean treating everyone in the same way. That's what equality means in the judicial system. So it's no wonder that men are treated more harshly. It is driven by policy. But here's a question for you. If you adopt that philosophy, just how much more harshly do you have to treat some people in order to achieve true equality? You haven't defined that.
Well, it's probably starting from the wrong premise. I mean, we had a very interesting interview with Chris Daw, QC, leading defence barrister, who's written a book about the failures of the justice system. And one of his main planks of his argument is that prison, in fact, is damaging, and the harshness of prison in itself is a damaging component which causes more crime. And so if you start from saying, well, how harsh do you have to be? You're asking the wrong question, really. He's a defense barrister, but he's making a logical argument about the harmful effects of imprisoning people. It may be necessary, as he'll be frank about it, it's necessary for some people, but the way you run your prison can either cause more crime by the way it damages people, takes away their future opportunities, or you can use a prison as a place where people can achieve change. And that applies to men as much as to women. Well,
it does, you see. I mean, whatever view you take on punishment, whether you take the, we must punish them or line, or we must rehabilitate them line, you should treat the two sexes the same, it seems to me. And that's what's not happening. It's leaning one way for women and leaning the other way for men.
I want to link what you're talking about to what you talked about previously with us about the education of boys in particular, and the way in which the education system is biased against white working class boys. Because again, linking
and black Caribbean boys, don't forget.
Yes, and that whole presentation you gave us about bias in the education system, because another of Chris Daw QC's main arguments is that children should not be criminalized by the way they're treated when they commit offenses. And obviously the education system is different from the criminal system, but nevertheless, we're talking about an inclination to respond to children's behavior in a way which puts them into a pathway into prison and a life of crime. And if you treat boys badly in the education system, so their opportunities are limited and they find crime is where their opportunities lie, you've started your problem way before these statistics on adult prisoners. You've channeled people into a pathway which and maybe boys more than men, boys more than women, because of the bias in the education system.
Well, we know that boys are excluded 3 times more often.
Yes, so we try. I think there's a pattern we're talking about here, which is from bias in childhood leading into bias in adulthood, and the accelerating bias which you're describing because of these changing ratios over recent years of more men being imprisoned is part of some kind of misguided public policy, which is that punishing people and incarcerating them somehow is the answer to crime.
Yes, I mean, and it's certainly the case that the men that are in prison have disproportionately been excluded from school when they were school age, and also if you look at the IQ distribution of prisoners, it's skewed towards low IQ.
And they could well have been in care as well, couldn't they?
And disproportionately from care.
Yeah.
So all these things are part of the issue. If you're an educational failure, then you're going to find it hard to earn a living in today's society. And
again, going back to Fiona Murphy's comment,
Naomi.
We're all getting her name wrong. Naomi Murphy's comments. She's talking about the influence of childhood abuse and neglect on these men in high security prisons, these most dangerous people, and the widespread problems of the male prison population and probably the female prison population, but that's not her focus. And the problem starting early in childhood when social services are not intervening and society is not intervening in families where children are being abused or neglected, so that these problems then escalate through the education system, as you've told us, and then escalate again through the prison system, leading to society paying a huge price for its neglect of early childhood issues.
And then they have children.
Tell us about the woozles, Rick.
Here, there's three, I think I've got 3 or 4 woozles here. There's the claim that 84% of women prison sentences are for non-violent offences. Strictly, this isn't a woozle because it's true. But what people who cite this don't tell you is that that's equally true for men. So as we've seen, the proportion of women and men being imprisoned for violence is about the same. So again, this is an attempt to bolster the narrative, to say we should treat women less harshly because of this. Well, the same logic would apply to men, is all I'm saying really there. People will say that women are more likely than men to be imprisoned for a first offence. It's simply not true. The opposite is the truth. Here's the data. So this histogram shows the proportion of offenders sentenced for an indictable offence who have no previous sanctions, in other words, no previous offences. So immediate custody, blue is men, you're nearly twice as likely to be sentenced to immediate custody for a first offence if you're a man. It's not the other way around. Whereas women are twice as likely to get a conditional discharge and somewhat more likely to get a fully suspended sentence. So it's the opposite of the truth, but you will hear that said over and over again. And the other favourite is women are more likely than men to be imprisoned for minor offences like shoplifting. Well, again, it's false. And quoting from the MJ report, Statistics on Women and the Criminal Justice System, 2015, the custody rate in 2015 for females sentenced for shoplifting was 15%, and for males was 22%. So it's more for men than for women. And it also states that for both sexes, 89% of offenders sentenced for shoplifting had a previous caution or conviction for shoplifting. So they're just amongst the, what I think is part of the popular narrative to rationalise what we all feel is right, and that's a more lenient treatment of women, and but not for men. But it's based on actual falsities in these cases. They're just misrepresenting the data. And they'll go on saying it despite the fact it's clearly false. It's quite remarkable.